And
Okay,
before we
good.
get started, I think we're going to begin, and I want to properly introduce Dr. Lucas. Dr. David Lucas teaches public speaking and Spanish at Mount West Community and Technical College in Huntington, West Virginia. Dr. Lucas also serves as the CEO of David Lucas Communication, Inc. Dr. Lucas has 2 bachelor's degrees, 2 master's degrees, and a PhD that rounds out his academic qualifications. He identified and defined the qualitative research method known as folknography. He has led numerous students on folknographic research projects over the many years he has been teaching. It was through these folknographic efforts that Dr. Lucas discovered so many features of the Underground Railroad in Southern Ohio. His presentation entitled Southern Ohio, A Gateway to Freedom highlights some of these findings. So Dr. Lucas, thank you for being here, and we're very excited to have you, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us today. And I want to start out by saying to you that I in no means want to pretend that I'm an expert on the Underground Railroad, because it's such an expansive a topic that includes several different states and locations and realms of topic that I don't want anyone to think that I'm an expert. However, I will addendum that by saying that I have become very, very familiar with the operation of the Underground Railroad along the Ohio River, the southern part of the state of Ohio, from, and as we'll see in a few minutes, from about Marietta all the way down through to Cincinnati. So that's kind of where we're going to be heading in this 2-part series, talking about those ramifications, those elements of the Underground Railroad, which in the last few years that I've been doing this with students and with people here in Southern Ohio, very interested in it, has inspired me, totally inspired me. And it is a topic that as a young man, I didn't hear about or know about, unfortunately. And as I got older and went through my various degrees in the universities, where I still didn't get a proper eye-opening, I would say, to this. And I stumbled upon this doing another research project, and it just has become very important to me to continue the study. Second, I don't want anybody to think I'm a historian, because even though, and I was thinking about this morning as I awoke and was doing some meditation and pondering and reflection, and I thought to myself, Dave, how did you end up here? And the reality is that as I did this cultural research and these topics that you do when you go into an area and ask them questions about what's important to them or what they know about in their region, that's how this all popped up. And I often end up in history, even though I'm not a certified qualified historian. So I kind of want to make those 2 statements before we begin, and then also say, if at any time you have a question or want deeper information, as long as we have the time, we'll do that. So don't think that you'll interrupt me. It doesn't throw me off. So this is Southern Ohio, Gateway to Freedom, and this is part 1. Part 2 is next Thursday. And I want to thank you all again for having me. I'm very honored. I feel very blessed for this moment. So let's take a look at this and let's get some definitions down, because anytime that you're talking about a specific topic, if it's debatable, you want to make sure that at least you know where I'm coming from when I use these terms. And these may be different from yours. You know, your definitions may be different, but in this presentation and also next Thursday, these are the concepts that we have. The Underground Railroad was a loose network of African Americans and whites who helped enslaved individuals escape to a free state and then try to get to Canada in most cases. We found out that a lot of these folk got to Southern Ohio across the Ohio River and were discouraged or shocked to find that they were still under duress. And so they had to continue their journey forward. And a lot of them ended up in Cleveland because that was the passage sort of way to get on up to Canada. The reason that's true is because Canada had an open society, no laws against the blacks. Even though they got to Ohio, they found out that they had what were called the black laws, which is very discouraging for them and very shocking to me. Again, an item which in all of my education, which I deeply appreciate having, I never realized that this continued for so long for them. The drinking gourd is symbolic, and this whole idea of the drinking gourd, the Big Dipper, is the constellation of stars that allow identification of the North Star. And so I just noticed a typo there. I've got O, but I'm not O. In this idea of the Underground Railroad, we use a lot of railroad imagery. Railroad was the railways and all of that became very important because it was very life-changing for the nation and for especially for the northern part of the country, but also the south, because you could deliver goods without the river or tributaries. And that became sort of the imagery. We do this now with, well, just Google it or text it. We use the same kind of terms. And so today, those modern concepts and terms are exactly what they were using at the time to describe what they were doing. And these were a whole set of clandestine terms that were used by these loose free agents in this network to participate in this attempt at freedom for these enslaved peoples. Now, when we get to this term, freedom seekers, it's sort of a quandary for us. We'll learn that there are several terms that could describe these people that were participating, and especially by the time they got to the Ohio River, regardless as to the passageway or crossway. And the best term that I like using is this idea of freedom seekers, but there's another term, and we'll look at all of these in a minute. You know, there are other terms that people used at the time. So I just want to make sure that we kind of have a concept so that you're not lost. Well, I actually keep talking about a drinking gourd. What does that mean, so that we all kind of know where we are? Now we look at this general topic of the Ohio River. And this Ohio River was a menace and also a miracle for these freedom seekers. And the reason I say that is because on the south side, if you will, or sometimes the east side of the river, depending on the location, they were still suspect. They were still under duress. They were still threatened by bounty hunters. And this whole idea of bounty hunters, if you ever have the time and want to continue your research or your own personal investigations for your own satisfaction, what a hideous concept of people chasing after these pieces of property as they were considered in the South. Just a hideous concept. So foreign to a lot of our thinking now. And so they would license these people, pay them with bloodhounds and coon dogs and all kinds of weaponry to go chase these people down. They had shackles, they had chains with them, and they would ride after them with the dogs on their trail. And when they got to the Ohio River, they thought this was going to be their miracle. And the Ohio River changed dramatically from what it used to be. When the Native Americans were in Portsmouth, for example, Big Shawnee settlement down there in the Portsmouth region, you could walk across the Ohio River waist deep water. You know, the deepest part of the Ohio was in Louisville. It was about 20 feet deep there. That was before the locks and dams installed by, the Corps of Engineers. And so some places it was 4 feet, 3 feet, because it was very wide and a shallow river. And so it's not the same river. When we talk about the Ohio today, you can't drive across the bridge there in Huntington or Ashland or wherever you are, even Cincinnati, and say, oh yeah, this is what it looked like, I can imagine. Well, no, it didn't. All these valleys got here because this river flooded all the time and got out of its banks and made these big, wide sort of valleys for us here. It was the visionary destination. They didn't know what the Ohio River looked like. They didn't know what they were up against. They didn't know, depending on when they started their journey, from wherever they started their journey, they didn't know if they were going to have to cross ice. They didn't know exactly what this river looked like. They just thought about it. They talked about it, and it became this symbol of freedom, this destination that if I can get there, I'm going to be free of all this beatings and starving and being owned by someone. Because I think, and this is more probably Dave Lucas and anecdotal, but I think deep within us, all human beings know that they're supposed to be free. They're not supposed to be owned or herded like cattle. I think we all know that. So it became a symbol of hope, and it fits the imagery of everything that was going on. Let's think back about this drinking gourd. That was the Big Dipper. And if you look at that Big Dipper, you look up and there's a small star that never changes, and that's the North Star. So that drinking gourd became the idea of fresh water while you're in the cotton fields, or fresh water while you're doing tobacco, or fresh, cool water while you're. So this whole idea, I'm going to the Ohio River, crossing over into the land of freedom where I won't be chased anymore. I won't be owned by anyone. I've got to get there. I've got to get there. So then they picked up this other railroad. There's a station where I can change lanes or change rails and continue my journey. There's a station master, someone who wants me to make this journey, who encourages this journey for me. There are conductors, people who will help me get to the station or to meet a new station master. All of this symbolism became very important to them. They were on a particular line, and you'll see here in a few minutes why they said this, because there was not one way to get to Ohio, but a plethora of ways to get to Ohio and the Ohio River. And there are crossings. So you think of the railroad crossings and the crossings they were going to make. The whole idea of the railroad depots, places where you could deposit your meager belongings until you were ready to continue your journey. Agents, people who were just providing you with food or providing you with something that you needed on your journey. And you were passengers. This whole concept of all these symbolic terms are very important. They even talked about freight and moving things, or moving themselves as freight. They understood the idea that you had to have a ticket to get on this railroad. And it wasn't a true railroad. It was a path or a line or a direction. And it wasn't underground, no more so than the underground French resistance or anything else. This idea of underground did not necessarily always include tunnels or caves, although it did. The idea of underground meant that we're clandestine. And this is the moment where I need to tell you that that's why we don't have a lot of factual, strong evidences, because they kept all of the secret. If they were caught, it meant death, or back where they were, same as death. If the whites that were doing this were caught, sometimes they were fined $1,000. And if they weren't around any good law enforcement, they might be beaten or, chastised. But very few whites lost their lives. A lot of these folk, African Americans, lost their lives. There are stockholders. The idea that somebody is investing in this. There's a freedom trail, a freedom rail that we ride. And they were big on pageantry and metaphor from the Bible and from church worship times. So the idea of heaven and the promised land and Canaan land, and all these songs that they sang were evidence of their desire to be in a better place, and not after death necessarily. So a lot of that was a part of what we're looking at. So the picture there you have is an old picture of the Ohio River. And you can see that this is an important river, but it was more shallow and often a lot more wide. If they arrived here in April or May, the river might be way up. In the summertime, it might be low. In the fall or winter, in those days, especially if they got here in November, it would have been iced over.
Dave,
Yes, please.
I think you're still on camera and not on share screen. We can't see any of what you're seeing.
Oh,
Or at
I'm
least I
so
can't.
sorry. I'm so sorry.
I may be
sorry.
the only one, but I don't, I just,
No, we can't see it. Can you hit your
Well,
share?
I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. I gave you your co-host, so you can share your screen.
I don't know, well, why not? Hang on just a second here. Let me try to figure out what's going on. I thought I was so good. Really, I did. I thought, oh, I am just doing such a good job here. Let me try to get out of this.
There's a green arrow button at the bottom of your screen that
It
lets you
says-
share your screen. See if that'll help.
Let me put this down a minute. I thought I did that. I apologize. Okay, now we're going to start over here.
Ah, there we go.
Now
That's your
let's-
Zoom.
Yeah, let's try to get our, is that back up? Do you see that there?
There you go. Yes.
Okay, good, good.
Thank you.
No, I'm thankful.
just go to slideshow.
Yeah, that was very funny. I apologize. I can't see my little window there.
I think you have to go to slideshow. Did someone just say that?
Well, usually I can hit that. Let me see if I can push this down a little bit. No, that's not going to work either. Oh boy, I've done this so much, and this is not acting like.
There you go.
On the bottom bar, along with it is a screen share. It looks like a little projector screen.
Yes, I know. That's what I'm looking for, but it's not showing up on mine. I don't know why either.
Your slides are all listed on the clipboard. So if you can get that first one to move, the others will follow along.
Yeah, I've got this, all this Zoom is in the way of my little screen like he was talking about.
Can you minimize your Zoom?
If you move your cursor up into the screen area, then I do the same thing. Above the black bar that's a Zoom bar, I see the PowerPoint bar.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Take your time. We'll get this.
No, I apologize because generally I go right over and click that, but
Oh, I see your cursor now. Don't you see the little right to the left of the volume? Is a movie screen.
yeah, but what I'm seeing, and this is the problem, is right here is all the Zoom, and it's blocking that bar.
Well, we can just watch the slides on the right and make our brain ignore the slideshow on the left.
Yeah, I hate to do that for you though.
It's so minimal. I don't think it's going to be a deterrent.
Are you
Like if
sure?
you click on that, no, click on number 2. Does it come over to the screen?
Yeah, I can do that. I can do that.
You're just gonna have to do it, man. No,
These are your definitions there.
that's fine. What's on the left will not be a deterrent to us.
Well,
Really?
I'm so sorry because
It's
like I
okay.
say, that big
It's okay.
black screen is there. When I did I did a practice run before you all came on and it wasn't there. So
If you try to fill in your screen, does that work at the top when you hit the little square at the top? Yes.
oh yeah, there we go. Oh, good. Yeah, that worked. There we go. Now
Ah,
you should have it now, right?
yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Thank you for your help,
apologize.
Dr. Walker. It's okay.
Oh
Thank
my
you, Dr.
gosh.
Walker. All right, we're good. We're good.
All right, we talked about these, I'm sorry, we talked about these definitions. I'm sure that you probably picked that. This is the typo here that I told you about. All right, and then this is the picture of the Ohio. I've already talked about all this destination and symbol of hope, but this is the picture of Ohio that that would have been back at this picture. It's actually an engraving, was done back in the 1850s. And so this was before the Corps of Engineers and so on. So it's pretty interesting. So anybody have any questions? I kind of passed over this without you seeing it. And so now you're able to envision this. So when we're talking about the commitment that these folk were making, this is something that I've not seen anywhere else. How long did it take them to make this journey? Now, quickly, I want to say that this is mostly speculation. Here's why. That we don't know how long they walked each day or each night. Sometimes they would sleep and hide in the daytime and then travel at night. It seems very perilous to me, but we know that happened. And we don't know if they walked 8 hours. So these averages come from the idea of walking 6 to 8 hours a day or at night. We don't know how fast they were able to walk. We assume because most of them were in high muscular, physical, good shape, most of them, that they were able to make this journey at a fairly good pace, that they paced themselves well because they worked hard all the time. Even the domestic enslaved peoples worked hard every day. And so they were able to make this journey from here, North Carolina to Ohio on that pace in 35 days. Now that's if they traveled every day. And we know that there were occasions when they would lay over. So you can add your days as you start to think about this. Did they stay 2 days here? Did they stay 4 days there? But we know that they did not stay anywhere in this journey very long, because most of the time at some point they were under duress, being chased. And so, it kind of makes it hideous. So that's kind of the thing here. And from Virginia to Ohio, about 25 to 30 days, depending on, again, their course. Again, we don't know the exact routes every time they took because the routes varied, but they knew to stay north. We know that was the constant, that the given message to any of these folk who moved on their way, that they were headed north, straight north, as much as they could. To be honest, I've not read any research to let us know what happens on 4 cloudy nights or 4 cloudy days. What did they do? Of course, in the daytime, they could figure out where the sun was and they would know their direction that way. But if they traveled at night, which a lot of them did, if it were real cloudy, they had to rely on their own recognizance, and they were very close to the earth, much like Native Americans. Native Americans always knew where they were. They never got lost. Native Americans didn't get lost. These blacks did not get lost very often because they knew by the feel of the ground, by the touch of everything, and the nighttime sky. They kind of knew directions, and once they headed north, they sort of knew which way they were headed. From South Carolina was probably the longest journey, but you can see these paths lead directly north. And so that makes sense to us that they were able to go to Ohio a lot. Now, we're not the only state, however, and I don't want you to think that, that they crossed over. They did this up through Indiana. They did this even some into Illinois. It depends on how they sort of started their direction and what transportation they were able to get, or if they walked the whole way, or if they were able to get onto wagons or whatever. It depends on their agent. It depends on their conductors. It depends on the station master and who was telling them where to go next and how they had it routed. So these are only sort of averages for us to give us a mental vision of how very difficult this journey had to be. From Georgia to Ohio, about 32 days. So pretty great commitment on their part, pretty courageous, pretty brave. And I have been a scout leader for a long time, and I've done a lot of backpacking. And to be honest with you, I don't know that I would ever say, hey, this is a great idea. Let's walk from Ohio all the way down to South Carolina. Let's walk to Georgia. Now, there are people who do this though. The Appalachian Trail is very long, and there are people who do this. So it is humanly possible. It's humanly possible to do this without a whole lot of calories. And yet, you think about eating on this trail, very difficult to think about. So where did they cross? Now, again, I want to let you know that they didn't necessarily cross exactly at this place, but this was where they ended up going to some location of population on the Ohio side. Now, why is that? You're in Huntington, or many of you are in Huntington, West Virginia, but actually you're in Virginia for them. If you think about this is Virginia. And so they have to get across that river. So there's not as much destination although Huntington was certainly a place that they ended up and crossed over. You know, they might have been as far north as Point Pleasant and so forth. So that east side or south side of the Ohio is not as critical to them as getting across that Ohio. Marietta was a big crossing place. If they crossed north of it or south of it, they walked back up the river or down the river to get over there to find an agent's, a conductor or someone who would help them. And again, they did this a lot at night. I can't imagine the trepidation of crossing over the Ohio and then headed on down to Marietta. Pomeroy, also a crossing place. And of course, you could even see there in the Pomeroy picture at the landing on the right side. And so, you're going to go maybe to that landing or close to it, and then you've got to get across that river. Now, the question comes, how do you do that? Well, sometimes you get a board or pick up a log and you start kicking and using that as a flotation device to get across the river. Sometimes there were agents on for example, Huntington side that would have a boat, and if you found them and you got directed to them, they would take their rowboat, their oar boat, and row you across the river, park you over there and tell you who to go see. But this is a shot in the dark. This is all as you would say, a roll of the dice. There's no certainty in any of this. And again, it seems so perilous to me and so incredible to me that they made this journey. You can look here at Marietta, a lot of flat ground, a lot of portages where you could get out into that river and move across. We have stories that are verified, evidences of swimming across the river, walking on the ice in the wintertime, floating on ice, big chunks of ice floating across the river. I don't know how you sustain that other than your body is much more accustomed to cold weather and exposure than ours would be today. I mean, most of us have central heat and we try to stay warm, but I can't imagine what they did once they got across the river and they were all wet. I just can't imagine. They did it. I know they did it, but I can't imagine how they did it. Any questions here? I just want to make sure that we have kind of covered this for you. Rio Grande up there at Gallipolis, was an area that they crossed. Proctorville, Ohio, they crossed there. Again, Proctorville's got a big flat basin. And so it's easy to see from the north side of Huntington to look across and see that it's flat. There wouldn't be a lot of lights. We have a lot of light pollution now. There wouldn't have been a lot of lights. And so a lantern lit in the darkness would have stood out. You would have caught that and you would have noticed that because a lot of the homes and at that time were like closed up and have shining lights outside, inside. You know, there weren't street lights, and so one lantern or two lanterns would show up more. And so Rio Grande and the area around Gallipolis was a big crossing port. Proctorville and Burlington, we'll show you in a minute. Chesapeake there also. And they ended up at these places a lot of times because of the tributaries. They would a lot of times follow a tributary. They knew it was flowing somewhere. And so they would pick up on that tributary often. And that's how they ended up at the particular river that dumped out into the Ohio. Then they would move up and down the bank, look across, try to pick out the best place for them to cross, or contact an agent or find an agent or a conductor that would help them. There's an actual picture of the old Burlington courthouse and jail. We know, and I don't know if you've done the study of the 37 that came here. They were set free by their I call them captors, but sometimes in the literature they're called masters. They were enslaved, set free, and he got them some property here at this area for them to come. 37, actually it was only 34 that finally made the journey and came here. But that's all about Burlington. They came to Burlington, they're homesteaded here. Macedonia up on the hill, the church there was established by these Black freedom seekers, and they crossed, then they empowered others to cross here. Now, next week, we will talk about a lot of these agents, these actual individuals in our region that were very active and at the peril of their own life. These people in Burlington, for example, could have just as easily been captured again and taken back and sold back into the slavery process or back to their original master. You know, this was never a comfortable situation for anybody. Even though these people were in Ohio, that didn't ensure them freedom, as we've already said. Now, Ironton was a big crossing point, and a lot of people don't know that. There's some evidence that over 2,000 to 3,000 people made their way to freedom through the Ironton area. It would have been Hanging Rock, it would have been up, up by Coal Grove, all of that area along the bank there on both sides is pretty flat Ashland area. And so a lot of those, and that's where we stumbled onto all of this sort of history we stumbled onto. We were actually out in a place called Porter Gap Road. It's a 4-mile road. And at that time, Ohio University, where I was teaching, was on the quarter system. And so each class of this research class that I taught, we would go out and do research on Porter Gap Road for 1 mile. So I had it divided up into 1 mile sections. We did interviews, we did pictures, we did people on and off the Porter Gap Road. And we started finding out about all of these things, about the furnaces and about how this all operated. So you can see here again, imagine yourself coming down out of those hills into that sort of valley area, and you're looking across the river there and you think, that's where I gotta go. And you see all of those traces along the bank where people are launching boats, parking ferries, parking flatboats. Those flatboats were the rage at that time. And they could have even brought you down from Marietta to here on a flatboat. I mean, there are several ways this happened. They, depending on, again, who helped you make the journey. And the old, some of the old cabins, or those of you there in Huntington, you might want to take a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon drive and go over to Burlington. The old stone jail, the original jail was log, but the old stone jail is there, and there's some log cabins back there. To give you a sense, stand along that river. They've got a little park there. Just stand there along that river and look out over the river and think to yourself, if I were going to swim across this river, how would I do this? And that's what you have to do. You have to get your mindset back into those moments that they were doing this. And again, These are my heroes. These people are my heroes. It's just an incredible feat that they did, and thousands of them did this. Now, Portsmouth was also a crossing, and again, there's a small flat ledge on the Kentucky side of Portsmouth. The Native Americans had worn paths through here everywhere, long before these folk began showing up. And several very important trails through the Native American crossed here. And like I said, this river you're looking at here in this Portsmouth picture is totally different than the river we now have. And at Portsmouth, sometimes it was only 4 feet deep, 3 feet on a dry day, you know, on a drought. Now, there are pictures, and I don't know if you'll believe this or not, because I didn't believe it, of a dry Ohio, where the Ohio River actually dried up. Now, there were big pools of water, you could still fish, but there were times when the Ohio would go completely dry, long before the Corps came in and began to regulate the water flow. So again, you standing here on this landing, you're looking across there. How are you going to get across? You know, how are you going to do that? If you're blessed, you've already contacted somebody who hates the institution of slavery, and they're trying to help you get to north. They're not going to keep you. They're not going to keep you. Even those station masters, they would only keep you maybe one night, and they're going to usher you on because they're going to get in trouble. They're illegal trouble or worse, you know. And so you have to think about that as you look at this. Now, a little farther south is historical Ripley, and this is what a lot of people know about. Ripley, Ohio, was the famous preacher Rankin, who was a Presbyterian preacher, and he got sort of run out of Kentucky, his church in Kentucky, because he preached a firebrand gospel that you had to believe in freedom for all or you're going to burn in hell. I mean, that was his message. I have 4 of his sermons, the only ones that I've been able to find written down, memorized, and he just was a firebrand preacher. But his gospel was a little bit different than others at the time, in that if you weren't an abolitionist, you were anti-God, and you were going to split the gates of hell wide open. He was really a firebrand on this. And he had a house, ended up with a house on top of a hill with a lantern burning most nights, especially during spring, summer, and fall, to welcome these people to Ripley. And you could do a whole study on Ripley. But we have a feeling that a lot of these same places I've showed you were, and I've found this evidence to sort of say that there were active people in all of these portals. John Rankin wrote a lot of his stuff down. People around him wrote a lot of his stuff down. People sort of wrote and evidenced the stuff. And I had a professor a long time ago said, if it isn't written, it isn't real. And I think maybe in academia that's true, that if it's not evidenced, if you can't cite it, well, it's not real. And so, but there have been a lot of people talk about these areas that we've mentioned to you already, that oh, there was this family or this person who was very active. I think John Rankin was just adamant. I think he was, from the evidences I've been able to pull together, he was a fanatic about this. He was fanatical about getting these people across. It might be because he took beatings for this. He did. And I think that he had to make a decision. I'm going to be fully committed or I'm going to back off. And I think he fully committed. So every fiber of his body was just so aggressive for this. And that's how Ripley became. And again, it would be worth your drive to go down there sometime when you've got a little time, a little family journey. You know, when I was a young man, my dad would take us on little journeys. You know, he didn't take vacations because we had a farm also. He worked at a factory. But we would go on drives. You know, we would go early Saturday, Mom would pack a lunch and we would go somewhere. I remember we went to cross a ferry over the Ohio because I'd never done anything like that before. And we just thought that was such fun. You know, people today would be so bored out of their skull, but we just thought that was such fun. This would be a weekend journey that would be worth your time if you're interested in the Underground Railroad, because they've got a lot more evidence. They've got a lot more material that you can kind of look at and sense and feel, rather than other of these places sort of have glossed over this or have lost the information. Now, let's talk a little bit. And again, please interrupt me if you have questions. That doesn't bother me at all. If you hadn't interrupted me, I'd still be talking to my slides and you'd be seeing nothing. So feel free to interrupt me at any time. Let's look at this. This is a process. This is a network. This is an activity. This is a system. It is a railroad in the sense that they're going from one place to the next place to the next place, and they're sort of at the mercy of all these people. Now, that doesn't make these white agents or these station masters, that doesn't make them the heroes. These people making this journey are the heroes. I think we all understand that. But there are, as they say in spy movies, there's tradecraft. How do you pull this off? Well, they had some tools and they had some tactics and they had some manners in which that they did this. And so, you know, we want to look at that. So first, we know here in Ironton, and this is really remarkable, that they used a lot of these false bottom wagons. And I've stumbled onto this out at LaGrange Furnace. We were out on Black Fork, and there was an old man out there whose family was raised out in that area. And he said, Dr. Lucas, have you ever heard about the false bottom wagons that they used during that? And I said, no, I never have. And so he began to describe these. Now, his description was a touch different because this has got entry from the back, but evidently John Campbell and his crew, who founded Ironton and who did all these furnaces, they had some side doors too to make it look like it was for storage for grain and other things. But these false bottom boats, and I don't know if you do this or not. I suppose if we wanted freedom bad enough and we hated being treated like this, that we would crawl up into that wagon with 6 or 8 other people. And then they're going to close that door and there's no light in there. And you're shut down in that wagon with a journey all day, probably to get up to Olive Furnace, probably, 2-hour journey to get out to LaGrange Furnace. But these furnaces were stations along the way. And these false bottom wagons were used throughout on the Ohio side. Now, there were some used down in other places. You could take a load of corn and you could put enslaved peoples in them. But especially around here, they used these wagons. And John Campbell, he had a bunch of these wagons. The founder of Ironton had a bunch of these wagons, and he would supply his iron furnaces, and he would ferry people on farther away from the Ohio. Now, the other thing we stumbled onto that I think is pretty interesting for the Ironton region, and I haven't done enough study or research to find if there are others of these up north or south, but you have to stop and say, well, there are a lot of Welsh immigrants brought over here. John Campbell, the furnace people, the people up in Proctorville, all of these folk wanted these Welsh. In fact, there was a whole bunch of course, the French went to Marietta first, right? Gallipolis, they went there. That was French area. But the Welsh came there later, and they burned their boats so they couldn't continue to go to Cincinnati. Now, why did they do that? Well, they burned their boats so they couldn't continue their journey, so they would stay there and work with them. Now, the Welsh worked in the coal mines. They dug coal mines. They worked in clay. They dug clay, and they were good at all that. They also dug a lot of basements and tunnels because that's what they really were skilled at. They had engineers. They wanted these Welsh engineers above all else. And so, because they were able to engineer. So a lot of these tunnels and these old railroad tunnels that we have around here were all engineered and dug by the well for their descendants. And so this tunnel you're looking at here ran from the Ohio River up to an old granary, an old livery, if you will, hay, grain, horses, stable. And it had an entryway in the floor that was covered by hay most of the time. But you could take foodstuffs, you could take grain, gunpowder, anything you didn't want to get wet. You had to hurriedly get it into the tunnel, get it up there. And at that time, recall now, the Ohio River was higher, not as dug out, not as low, not as deep as it is now. And so it was nothing to get a boat up here, get them ferried into this entryway. And it's about, it's probably a half-mile long. That's stupendous, isn't it? It's 3 brick layered, and it went up. It's collapsed about halfway through now, so it no longer goes to where it used to go. But there are 4 of these in Ironton. Now, they weren't built for the Underground Railroad. Yeah, and I realize that. I know that this was not built. It was built by John Campbell and all of his entrepreneurs who were at the Industrial Revolution making tons of money, whatever they did. And later was used by the bootleggers. This was a bootlegging tunnel. But at that moment, from the 1830s, maybe 1820s, up to the Civil War, the proclamation of emancipation, there were people who were ferried up here, put into these false bottom wagons, and taken north. I just can't imagine. Again, you have to pardon me for being so stunned, but every time I look at this and think about this, I mean, that's me walking up through that tunnel. I've been in that tunnel. I know what that feels like. I just can't imagine. It's amazing. So now this is a picture of Newark up there in Ohio, but I wanted to use this to give you an illustration. These kinds of paths, trails, and creek paths were everywhere. They're not anymore. But let me give you an example. There were multiple plethora of buffalo in our region. They're no longer here. We can drive out to Yellowstone and maybe see 100, but there were thousands of buffalo in the North American continent, especially up here. Now, when the buffalo out in the plains, they run in great big, you've seen the movies, all of these movies that show these buffalo hunters and them out on the plains and running them and so on. But here, the buffalo moved at about 8 or 9 abreast. And they moved in great big columns like an army. And in fact, during the French and Indian War, these trails were what those guys tried to use a lot because they were already all padded down and they were already crushed a lot of the small trees. And so they would move parallel to tributaries. So these paths then were picked up, of course, by the Native Americans. And so the buffalo, for as long as they were here, right through Huntington and right to Huntington. That's how George Washington got to Huntington when he did the surveys, was on great big buffalo trails. They're 8 buffalo wide, which is about 8 to 10 feet, usually 8 feet wide. And they moved through this territory like that. So they moved north to south as well, but they followed those tributaries. So along all of these tributaries would have been all these big paths. Now, so they would get a little ways off, but then they would always come back because buffalo need a lot of water. And so they stayed close to the tributaries. So that's how all these paths got started. And they made good wagon paths, or they made good solid footing for humans because multiple buffaloes over the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, patted them down. And they followed the same ones, up, north, south, whichever direction they were headed, east, west, all of those were there. So the Native Americans used all of these paths. Now, again, we don't get up in the morning and think, I think I'm going to walk to Cincinnati today. They didn't really walk anyway. They sort of went at a trot. But having said all that, these paths were in existence. When these folk were coming north, they would hit on these paths, and boy, just beautiful. Great moment for them, especially in the dark, because you could see your way clear in front of you, especially in the moonlight. or starlit night. Your eyes had gotten accustomed to it. So you could kind of see there weren't any trees or big barriers in front of you. This is what you followed. And again, they had lanterns and fires and signals and signs that they looked for. This lantern hung on an old barn in the night or a shed would have been a beacon of hope. It would have been a bright beacon of hope because you didn't have all the light that we do now. You know, today we've got a lot of, you know, it's just a whole lot of lights everywhere. And so you just don't notice one or two, you know, there's so many. And so this would have been a star, a beacon of hope. And probably the only reason that somebody would hang a lantern up. Of course, it was also a beacon for those guys who were chasing them. So here are some of those liveries, those old barns that have survived. And they use warehouses, they use stables, they use granaries. There's a home here in Ironton that is now owned by a judge that goes all the way back to the 1800s. The architecture, there are several of them here. Again, and I'm not trying to get you out of Huntington, but if you want to take they have a walking journey of architectural structures in Ironton. It's a beautiful journey. You can find it online also, but you go by some of these homes that were built in the 1830s from money from the great iron industry. The industrialists built them. And this judge, he was remodeling this home. His dad had owned it before him. And he found a complete room that was only accessible through the attic. So you would come up through the stables, go up a set of steps, go in the attic, and then go down into this room. The only reason you would have that and do that would be to hide people away until you could get them on their way. So John Campbell, these people, they use these homes with hidden rooms to give them sleep, maybe during the day. I can't imagine being, you know, closed up in a room all day long and then somebody come get you at night and ferry you on up. Possibly take you and put you in one of those false bottom wagons. Then out of the livery, you go north to take foodstuffs or grain or whatever north, or materials for the sledgehammers or whatever for the iron furnaces. But these were the stables that were used in and out. You could tell they're sort of closed up, but plenty of room. Now, all of that leads us to this moment where we start thinking about, how did they do this, really? How did they just decide that they were going to walk north hundreds and hundreds of miles? How did they do that? Well, you can't minimize the terribleness they were under, that they lived every day. People angry, people mean to them, beatings, no rest. That's where that expression, no rest for the weary, comes from. They just were even, and I tell people all the time, don't even try to rationalize the institution of slavery. Don't say there were some masters who were nice to them. Come on, stop it. You can't be nice to someone that you think you own. That's impossible. You know, it's just that those two ideas just don't meet. Now, again, I know that this is not the research, but I think about this all the time. And so they had to have just gotten to the point that they couldn't do it. They'd rather try to be free or die. They just couldn't do it. They couldn't take it. Inside of them, and I think a lot of this comes from their faith. They had a faith. They did, a deep spiritual awareness that they were human, that God loved them. And I don't want to start preaching here. I'm not. I'm just saying to you that you can't do this kind of research without recognizing the huge amount of faith that these people had. And they were taught. They went to, a lot of times they made them go to church, or the owner, the master, would make them go to church. They were trying to teach them to be obedient and but they got a lot more out of it than any people realized. They began to realize that there was a sovereign God who, in their minds, who loved them and that they didn't deserve to be treated this way. So they had a huge faith. Now it was different than, your average everyday white Christian today even. This faith was wrapped around this idea of being free and being open and live your own life and have justice and so on. So they had a huge faith. And there were people who picked up on this. You got to give them credit, especially the Quakers. I love these folk because they're just everywhere in this story. They're everywhere in this story. They're never rebellious or riotous or toting guns or killing people, but these Quakers, and the Quaker state, of course, Pennsylvania, they moved west and then over into the Ohio, and their whole concept was peace, and they did not embrace slavery at all. None of them did. And so when you do your own research, or if you do, you're going to find these folk popping up as great active folk who got them, fed them, and then ushered them to another place. And you've got to give these folk credit. Not as much of them now as there used to be, but I've been to some Quaker meetings, and it's just pretty refreshing to think about. These people kind of picked up on that. They weren't as flaming as John Rankin and some of those Presbyterian fellows who just got ticked off and sometimes even got physical. These people were always very peaceful, always very soft, always very careful, always nurturing. And I don't want to make them out to be super heroes, but they were really used in a mighty way in this whole story, not only throughout this area, but also in the rest of the whole area of the Underground Railroad. So they're pretty special people. Now, the Protestant Reformation also had a huge impact on this whole notion of freedom. The whole idea of, I'm going to walk away and reform our beliefs. That whole idea fed well into this idea for those who were enslaved. And you've got to give credit to the Presbyterians, as we've already said. And I'm using this in a general sense. Not every Presbyterian was a great flaming abolitionists, but a lot of them were. And the Methodists, you got to give them credit. So there's Presbyterians down in Portsmouth, Presbyterians here, your Scottish, Campbells. A lot of them were they didn't believe in abolition, or in slavery. They were all abolitionists. And but in the end, you come back to these heroes, these people held in captivity. Their parents before them, many of them, some of them brought the first generation, but a lot of them second generation. And they had this incredible, and you get this from reading the literature about them and their stories. And there are a lot of stories out there that you can find. They had a hope and belief in this great goodness of a creator. And so that shining light, that beacon, represented by, let's go back to the drinking gourd and the North Star, by the lantern shining in the darkness, by North, by walking. I'm going to walk my way to freedom. They had this sense that I don't know, I don't think any academic paper could ever pick up on this innate desire to get there. It was almost like they were going to heaven, and so I think this is a fitting symbolic picture of what they were thinking. There's a light beyond the Ohio River where I'm going to enjoy freedom like people around me. And pretty interesting to me and quite moving. Now, there was an entire unseen communication network. And we don't know all about this. And I'll admit that freely. They didn't want you to know. They didn't want anybody to know. That's why they talked in code and they used codes. They were spies. This was tradecraft for spies. Not the same, but if you've done any study on George Washington, you know that he had a whole network of spies, and they used all kinds of secret codes and networks. So this is not a new invention for our own CIA or back in the days of the KGB. George Washington was really good at this, and he recruited spies to ferry information. So this group of people developed in the same way, in the sense that necessity of secrecy, they developed an entire code or language, if you will, or symbolic language of how to get these people from one point to the other. And they were preachers who did this. Now, of course, this is my my friend John Rankin. I think I've become friends with him, even though he's dead, long gone. But he had a whole system of codes, lights, people that worked with him to get them from across the Kentucky over into Ripley, and even here in Ironton. He had an impact, a huge impact on all the Underground Railroad here in Ironton. And in fact, those folks stretched all the way up to Huntington and some down to Cincinnati. We'll learn more about that next week. But there are also these freedom societies. And you know, I have a feeling that you people who are watching this today, because you've got interest in this, you might have joined one of these freedom societies. They were great events where people would come together, and maybe some of the ladies would make pie, and they would secret out different mannerisms or activities that they were going to do when these freedom seekers would come across the river. Now, these people mostly in the freedom societies, and there was a freedom society in Huntington, in that settlement. There was a freedom society over in Proctorville, and of course in Burlington, and they varied in the way, because some of them were all Black. So those were sort of prayer meetings. These freedom societies, they would have a couple of pies and maybe some coffee or maybe some other brew, and they would get together and they would talk about, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do this. And they met throughout. Well, they became very strong in the 1850s, but they started these back in the 1830s. Rankin and a lot of these preachers, excuse me, would begin these, and they would very active up through the Civil War. And again, you don't read a lot about that, but you can read some reports and some information where people were very fastidious about keeping records, and they kept records hidden away, and we've found some of them and have them now. Maybe you have heard the old spiritual hymn, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And there's some indication that a lot of these songs that they sang were part of this code. Spirituals are a form of Christian singing that have African-American origin. The Africans had a very colorful and developed culture before they went through that middle passage of being locked down in the lower parts of that boat, that ship. I really get bothered by that whole concept. And so they brought a lot of that earthy, natural, environmental, spiritual awareness with them, and it was sort of infused into this white man's gospel, and it became a unique sort of experience. I spent a lot of time with folk down in South Carolina, and the prayer houses and praise house, and got an inkling of how that Black worship came into meeting with that white worship. And again, a lot of this was their hope and dream of something special ahead of them. So these codes were to communicate that there's help out there. There's somebody to give you direction. This sweet chariot will pick you up and carry you on. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming to take me home. Well, not only did they mean heaven, that was part of the symbol, but it was double fold. Where was home? Away from this mess, which is not my home. Coming to take me home to that beautiful place where I'm going to be free. And they were ready. It was a signal. At some instances, they would sing this. This is the night we're leaving. If 6 or 8 of them were leaving from a particular place, swing low, sweet chariot, coming to take me home, and they were going to go their way. And of course, these are the kinds of chariots they saw. Some of them were more extravagant than this, plumes and stuff on them. Some were in clothes, but they knew what a beautiful chariot looked like. And they knew that somewhere out there was a ride to freedom for them if they were that. Yeah. So how did they get these messages? Now, we won't go into a whole lot of this because there are too many of them. But there were these people who, on both sides of the aisle, and by that I mean on white people, and then our African American, the blacks, who did courageous things. We're going to talk a lot more about them next week. We'll get into these because that's what sort of led me through all this, with these personalities that you hear about and families that would tell me stories about their ancestor. But anyway, here you have John Fairfield on the left. Now he's a white guy, right? So, you know, for him to take the dangers that he did, the chances, if you will, that he did, it's a little perplexing. There were people who did this, like John Rankin. They did this. Now, this guy's not a preacher, but he disguised himself as a preacher. He disguised himself as a traveling salesman. And there were a lot of these traveling salesmen in the day. You know, we didn't have Amazon, right? No Amazon.com. So how are you going to get a new mixer, a hand mixer? You know, where's that all going to come from? These traveling salesmen, a new razor, straight razor. Where are you going to get that? Well, these guys. And they would come in and they would stay sometimes even at the plantation or farm or whatever. And they would whisper messages to the blacks. This guy did that all the time. His family were slave owners. He was not. And he hated that institution. So much so that he took some of his wealthy inheritance and he did this. He got word to them. So that's how a lot of this happened. Preachers did this. Traveling salesmen did this. Various folk, merchants, buyers for grain, people who hated the institution but knew the owners of these folk and they hated it. And so they would get the message. And I think that if you ever watched Roots or any of these other sort of Hollywood, Hollywood renditions of what was happening, that you have seen these guys in and out of those movies, and they were very much a part of what was happening at the time. On the other hand, you had guys like Richard Daley. John Fairfield was the white guy, and there are a lot more of them. He's just an example. And Richard Daley, again, this guy, you know, got to freedom, then went back in the darkness of nights and told other people about freedom. Hey, you know, you wouldn't think that once you got there, you'd go back, but they did. They went back, especially they would go down into Kentucky, Tennessee, those areas where they could get back and bring them back safely. And of course, there are other famous ones we'll talk about next week, but I wanted you to know that there were these folk who were working hard. And it's just incredible to think about that. Now, we're going to sort of get near our conclusion here to tell you that what happened, that, and again, I have not read this. This is sort of a novel aha moment. They had to decide to change their identity. Now think about this. The freedom seeker, the enslaved person or people, at some point had to come to grips with this idea. I'm going to become a new person. I'm not going to be the same person. I've been serving grits if you're a domestic slave. I've been cleaning the hall. I've been washing all the dishes. I've been cooking meals in this hot old kitchen. I've been sleeping on floors. I'm going to change. I'm going to change. I'm going to be something different. Now, that may not be the exact process they went through, But here are some names that you need to understand they called themselves. This is what they became. Some of them became wayfarers. Now that's kind of a light, soft name today, isn't it? A wayfarer, we even know there's a place that sells house goods, you know, wayfarer.com or whatever it's called, Wayfarer. But these people, wayfarers, they used this term, were on their way to a new place. They were going to a new home, new location. They were relocating. And so I think some of them say, I'm relocating. I'm going to go to a new home. And thus we go back to swing low seat chariot, all of this concept of taking the Underground Railroad, you know, to a new destination, to a new home. Then over here you have William Still, who talked about, they considered themselves passengers. They knew they couldn't do this alone. They didn't have the resources, but they also knew through the communication that there was help out there. And so they became passengers on this train, on this rail. And they became aware that other people were empowering them to become new, different, change. So they used that term passenger. They also became seekers. Now, why is that different than Wayfarer or William Still as a passenger? Well, these seekers didn't know where they were headed. They didn't understand how this was going to work. They just knew they wanted to be free. They sought freedom, whatever price, whatever cost, they had to have it. And I think that's pretty special too. So these are new identities. And it varied from family to family, person to person. A young man might be a wayfarer. A woman and her child might be a passenger. These seekers might be a family seeking a new location, but these are new identities for them. They are not defined by the term slave. That's why I won't use it. They were enslaved. They were not fugitives. And I disdain that idea. This wasn't illegal, not in the human sense, what they were doing. You can't say that's illegal for them to seek freedom. And so they weren't runaways. They were run-a-twos. They were running to a new place. So all of that terminology we need to sort of flush out of our conversation. Now, I don't want you to think I'm a council culture king. I'm not, but those are wrong words to describe what's happening here. Those are all wrong words. It's not what was happening. They weren't fugitives. They weren't criminals. They didn't deserve to be beat. They didn't deserve to be owned. No human should be owned. You shouldn't be owned. I shouldn't be owned. Nobody should be owned. And then they were sojourners. And this is Sojourner Truth. And you can look her up. You don't need me to tell you about her. But oh my goodness, what a woman. And she embodies this idea of sojourner. This captivity is part of my journey, but I'm going on. I'm moving on. And I'll tell you this story, and we may talk about this again next week some, but there was a man who made it to Ironton. I know this from the research. His name was Elijah. I don't have a last name for you. He told them his name was Elijah. He came across, he was on a boat. There was a conductor who got him across the Ohio here to Ironton, and he got in John Campbell's crew. Now, John Campbell didn't do this by himself, or he most of the time didn't do this on his own. He had other people that were agents of his that worked all of this Underground Railroad here in Ironton. But anyway, when Elijah got here, he said, thank God, I'm free now. I'm free. I'm in free Ohio. Those may not be the exact terms he used because we don't have exact quotes, but the idea was he was so thankful to be in Ohio. And they said, no, wait a minute. You know, they're still chasing you. They'll come across here with dogs. They'll try to find you. You're not really free because we have these laws here that we're supposed to turn you back over to the bounty hunters. And he said, well, where will I be free? In other words, how far do I have to go? And they said, well, probably Canada. And he started crying. And he said, my journey be not done. then my journey be not done. So he was willing to go on because he wanted that freedom so badly. And that's sojourner. That's a sojourner. That's someone said, I've been here, but I'm not going to look back at that and be all angry and violent about it. I'm going to look forward. And Elijah was a sojourner. And maybe next week we can talk a little bit more about his final destination, because there is an end to that story. Well, now here's your bib. If you want to look it up at some point, it'll be there, of course, on the recording and so on. I know it looks like a lot, but this is just, trust me, you could do an entire book just on bibliographies, annotated bibliography. It'd be probably 2 volumes, but there's a lot out there, and but not a lot about here. So that's kind of why we're doing this. And certainly a wonderful experience. And I want to thank you for watching. We've kept our time limits, and we appreciate it. And so let me try to get out of this. Stop the share. There we go. Okay.
Do you have any questions for Dr. Lucas? We've got about 10 minutes left. Any discussion?
Your picture is not on.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay. I think it was a fascinating presentation. And I think it's something that more people should become aware of. I'm curious, though, about the Huntington area. I've always heard that Cerrito was a crossing point.
Yes, it was.
Is that true?
Yes, that is true. That is true. And again, remember that, and I don't want you to think I was negligent in mentioning those sides, but they couldn't stay there really. You know, they were still under duress. And so, yeah, and again, there's not a lot known about that, because those people who were involved in it would have had to be very secretive about what they were doing. So they might not have even told their children, because we all know children tell things out of school. And if their children knew about what was going on, now maybe later, but maybe they died before they could tell all these stories. I mean, there are so many sort of clandestine parts to this, you know, that we'll never really know the full story of Cerrito, or even there at Holderber's Landing or on up, you know, all of these places, there's probably a whole host of stories that we may never know. But it's a good observation and very true. Cerrito was a place to cross over, yes.
And was the Ramsdale house part of that, or is that just legend, or we don't know?
No, that's true. It was. Yes. Yes, it was. Yeah, and that's a good question too. That's a good thought. But that's a good point too, is that this is so big that it's like I said at the beginning of our session, it might take, you know, we couldn't do it. Now, how long could we talk about Pittsburgh? How long could we talk about all those areas where there was so much action? You know, all the way up into Maryland and New York and all that, those folk who worked to get them north. We're talking, I had to kind of take, okay, here's our limits, you know, here's how far we can go.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for listening and being a part.
Any other questions or comments? Go ahead, Dr. Lucas.
No, I just was going to say the same thing you did. Any questions or comments? Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you for watching.
Thank you. And we will see you next Thursday at the same time. And
Yeah.
What was our homework?
Yes, this is your homework. There's one aspect of this that I'm a real skeptic. You know, as an academic, you're taught to be skeptical as well and ask questions. I didn't mention, you probably noticed, I didn't mention the quilts. There's this whole thing about quilts.
Okay, that's an interesting question, because my daughter wanted to do a social studies project on the quilts. And one of our speakers kind of told us that was folklore. But then I've read other things and it isn't folklore. So
that's
we
your
would be
homework.
Okay, well.
Do a little bit of cursory work during this next week and kind of come back to our session and give your impression. I have my own impression, but I won't reveal it until next week. But you notice I didn't touch on the quilts. I touched on the symbol, the pictures and so forth, but I didn't touch on the quilts. And so just kind of you don't have to do great big paper on it or anything. I'm just saying, do your own explore and see what you think as you come back. Because I have a notion that I've got the solution to this, but I don't want to let the cat out of the bag until next week.
Get off.
Sounds fair. Very good.
All right.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And I've been fascinated throughout this whole presentation, and we look forward to next Thursday. And we will have some homework about the quilts.
Yes.
So the question is, did they hold hidden messages? Is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question. Did they hold hidden messages, and how did they use them if they did? So, I mean, those are the kinds of things you want to kind of think about. The practicality and so on. Quilts has always been a big thing in Appalachia, and throughout the South. They were necessities to keep us warm. But did they provide signals in the Underground Railroad? I think we have to think about that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, and we'll see everyone again next Thursday. Thank you again. This was
thank you so
fascinating.
much. I hope it was okay. Thank you.
It was more than okay. Thank you. We'll see you soon. All right, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.